When I tell my story to friends, they usually laugh or skeptically purse their lips, suggesting that I just imagined it all. But I'm not joking. I no longer know what peace is, and even after moving, I still feel the weight of something pressing down on my shoulders. A couple of years ago, I moved to a different part of town. At that time, I'd long dreamed of living alone, far from the noise and bustle. My new home was small, just 5 floors, with only a few people living there. The building was quiet, the neighbors were friendly, and for the first few weeks, I was simply enjoying the solitude. It felt like this place was made just for me. At first, everything was perfect. But one day, I noticed something strange. There was absolute silence in my building. Absolute. No sounds from neighbors, no loud music, no conversations through the walls, no noise from the elevator. Initially, I was pleased. This was the peace I'd wanted. But over time, the silence started to unsettle me. It's a strange feeling, living among people, yet constantly feeling like you're the only inhabitant of the building. It was as if no one lived nearby. The next day, I accidentally ran into one of the neighbors in the elevator. A middle-aged woman, polite but distant. I asked her if anyone else lived on my floor. She said yes, but didn't go into detail, just adding that the other neighbors worked late and were rarely home. However, her gaze froze on my face for a split second. I noticed it, and a chill ran down my spine. Time passed, and life in the building started feeling stranger. Often coming home late in the evening, I'd find my apartment door wasn't exactly as I'd left it. Only a couple of times did I actually check, but I started doubting myself. Maybe I just forgot how I locked it. But no, I distinctly remembered always locking the door with 2 turns of the key, and yet a couple of times it had been locked with just 1. I started suspecting that someone was entering my apartment, but I couldn't find direct evidence. So I bought a camera and set it up in the hallway, thinking that at least this way I could understand what was going on. For the first few days, nothing suspicious appeared. I began to relax, but then, one night I heard strange sounds at the door. It was around 2 in the morning, and it felt like someone was very carefully turning the door handle. I froze, listening. The door creaked ever so slightly, and I felt like someone was standing just outside. I held my breath, afraid that any sound might scare them off. In the morning, the first thing I did was check the camera. The video showed something flickering in front of the door at 2 a.m., but it was so quick it looked like a shadow. A chill ran down my spine. I realized that someone really had been in my apartment. Then I decided to change my habits a little. Now I locked not only the lock but also the chain, checked the windows, and even started arranging furniture so I would notice if anything was moved. Everything stayed calm for about a week, but then the strange events began again. One morning when I walked into the kitchen, I noticed that a spoon was missing. Just a spoon and nothing else. A small thing, of course, but it made me uneasy. I clearly remembered leaving it on the table, but now it was gone. I searched the whole kitchen, thinking I'd just forgotten where I put it, but it was nowhere to be found. That was strange. From that day on, these things started happening more often. Spoons, knives, and sometimes small items from shelves would disappear or change places. Once I came home to find one of my shirts lying on the couch, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it in the closet. My anxiety grew, and it became harder and harder to relax. I checked the camera again, but found nothing. The footage showed that no one had entered the apartment at night. So I decided to try one more trick. Before going to bed, I would hang a thread on the door handle so it would break if someone tried to open the door. But each time, the thread was untouched. At some point, I started thinking I was losing my mind. I couldn't find any logical explanation for these strange things. But each day, my nerves were on edge. I felt cornered, yet understood that I had no evidence. After a month of these strange occurrences, I decided to invite a friend to stay over for the night. He was skeptical, but agreed to spend the night in my apartment. We drank some beer, chatted until late, and then went to separate rooms to sleep. I went to bed feeling relieved, knowing I wasn't alone in the apartment. In the middle of the night, a whisper woke me up. I was sure I heard a conversation, quiet and barely audible. It seemed like the sounds were coming from the living room. My heart raced, and I froze listening. I thought that maybe my friend had woken up and was talking to himself. I decided to get up and check, but when I walked into the hallway, no one was there. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, but the room was empty. My friend was asleep, oblivious to what had happened. In the morning, I told him what I'd heard, but he just laughed. He said I was probably just imagining things and that there was nothing here, but I knew what I'd heard. Weeks passed, and I no longer knew how to deal with this feeling. I decided to change the locks, even though I knew it probably wouldn't help. But one day I came home to find something strange. In the kitchen, right in the middle of the table, lay the missing spoon, the very one that had disappeared weeks ago. It was carefully placed, as if someone had deliberately left it there as a reminder. At that moment, I realized I couldn't stay in this apartment any longer. Within a couple of days, I packed up my things and moved out, not even thinking about the cost. It felt like the only way I could escape the growing anxiety. But this story didn't end when I left that apartment. A while later, I found out from the new tenant that they too had started noticing strange disappearances and the feeling that someone was watching them. Now, when I tell this story, I still can't believe it really happened to me. I'm not a particularly sociable person, and I've always thought that was fine. I have a few close friends, some colleagues that seemed like enough. I didn't feel the need to constantly be around people to feel comfortable. On the contrary, I always thought solitude brought me peace, but this story made me see things differently. It all started with a simple event. We got a new boss at work. Nothing supernatural. Yet this change subtly affected my life. The new manager was one of those who paid close attention to his employees, noticing little details, then making suggestions. One of his first directives was to socialize more with colleagues. In his view, a close-knit team was key to success, and I was politely nudged to be more open. This task proved harder than expected. I was used to my routine, to my quiet evenings alone. But to avoid standing out, I agreed to team-building events, lunching with coworkers even though it felt awkward. Gradually, almost without realizing it, I got into the swing of things. I started talking more, spending more time with others. A few months passed, and at some point, I noticed my attitude towards solitude had shifted. It no longer felt calming. Instead, evenings alone began to bring a strange tension. I first noticed it one night when I was coming home. It was late, dark, with nearly empty streets, and suddenly I felt as though I wasn't alone. Not that someone was following me, just a strange, oppressive feeling. It didn't go away until I got inside my apartment and closed the door. From then on, it happened nearly every night. I knew it was probably just a result of changes in my life, that after spending time with people, it was harder to be alone, and this was just a temporary feeling. But it didn't go away. Instead, it only grew stronger. I began to notice how much lighter I felt at work compared to how tense I was at home. After a couple of weeks, I thought maybe I just wasn't sleeping well. Maybe my apartment, where I spent so much time alone, was becoming associated with stress. Finally, I decided to experiment, spend a couple of nights at my parents' place, see if it would help. The first night went well. I felt the comforting presence of my family around me. I slept deeper than I had in months, waking up refreshed. It seemed like a good sign. So I returned home, certain that my odd sensations would end. But when I got back to my apartment, that oppressive feeling returned. It felt as if the walls were closing in, and the silence was unbearably loud. I tried to distract myself, turned on the TV, scrolled through my phone, but nothing helped. At one point, I even considered moving, but it seemed silly. Why would I? This was just a feeling, and I had to get through it. Days went by like this. I'd come home, feel that strange unease, somehow get through the evening and leave for work with relief in the morning. Until one morning a colleague called. He lived nearby and suggested we walk to the office together. I found it a bit odd, but thought it would be a good chance not to be alone. For the first few days, we walked together, and it really helped. He was talkative, sharing stories from his life, funny things. I felt myself relax a bit. But one day I asked him what had prompted him to suggest we walk together. He hesitated, then said he'd once seen me leaving home, but not alone. I didn't understand and asked him to explain. He looked at me as if I was joking. "Come on," he said. "I saw you leaving the building with someone." I couldn't believe what I was hearing and asked him to describe the person. But he just laughed and said it must have been my imagination. I started to recall my recent evenings. Could it be that in the shadows and the dusk when I was leaving the building, it looked like someone was with me? I dismissed his words as a joke, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. The next day, I asked him to check on me again when I left home. Reluctantly, he agreed. That evening, I stepped out. He even waited a moment to look around. No one was there. The next morning, I met my colleague, and he joked that I wasn't alone again. Alone with who, exactly? After that, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe someone really was following me. At work, it seemed ridiculous, and I tried to push the thought away. But every time I returned home, I paused at the threshold, listening to the empty apartment, sensing that same feeling that someone was there. I thought about cameras. These days, they're everywhere. I set up a couple in the hallway and near the door, just to check what was going on. I even talked to my colleague, asking him not to tell anyone since it all seemed absurd. I watched the recordings the first night. Nothing unusual, just me. Not a single soul in sight. Then, just as I started to feel relieved, something happened that shattered everything. The camera inside caught movement while I was asleep. A small flash in the hallway with me already in my bedroom. Then silence. On the screen, for a brief moment, a shadow appeared in the dark hall, shaped like a human silhouette. I turned off the recording, yanked the cameras out. The more I knew, the worse it got. I went back to my colleagues, told them I just needed to check on something. But it didn't change anything. Every evening, I returned home and sensed I wasn't alone. And when I asked my colleague one last time if he saw anything, he looked at me seriously and quietly said, "If you don't want to know who it is, don't look at them." Since then, I've never asked again. I don't look at the shadows. I don't turn around, even if I hear footsteps behind me. I keep moving forward, always forward. There was a time I thought living alone was a privilege. In my youth, I dreamed of having my own place, imagining how I'd return to an empty apartment and enjoy the quiet. I believed that living alone would allow me complete control over my space, free from annoying factors like noisy neighbors or intrusive relatives. And finally, after many years, I moved in. The area was quiet, full of greenery, with a small stream flowing under the windows, and just a 20-minute walk to work. The building was, of course, old, but that didn't bother me. Solitude was all I craved. At first, everything went smoothly. I enjoyed my isolated life and was, you could say, happy. But a few months in, I began to notice something strange. In the evenings, as I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about the silence. Initially, I dismissed it, but as I lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the city, I realized I never heard my neighbors in the building. Some might say I was simply lucky to live among quiet, peaceful people, and perhaps there was some truth to that. But what was odd was that every time I came home late, I never encountered anyone on the stairs or at the entrance. The hallway was free from food smells, music, conversation, or even the faint sounds of a TV. My floor was always empty, as if I were the only person in that part of the building. One day, after work, I decided to check the state of the other apartments on my floor. There were 4 on each level, so logically, at least one should have someone living there. I walked down the corridor listening carefully to any sounds behind the closed doors, but heard absolutely nothing. No rustling, no hum of a refrigerator, not even a faint cough, just complete silence. The next day, I decided to ask the concierge about my neighbors. The elderly woman reluctantly replied that the residents on my floor come and go, but she couldn't provide any specific details. I found this strange, and since then I began noticing even more details that unsettled me. For instance, I realized that the doors to neighboring apartments never seemed to open. I got up early and came home late, yet I didn't see anyone, even by the dumpsters outside. Once I took a day off to stay home, hoping to spot one of my neighbors, but I heard nothing all day. My apartment seemed to exist in a vacuum. Over time, this silence started to weigh on me. In the evenings, I stopped enjoying the quiet. Instead, it began to oppress me. It was hard to explain, but I felt as if I was constantly being watched, even though no one was around. The feeling grew until I started leaving lights on, even at night. Gradually, I felt as if something or someone was hiding in the shadows. I even bought night lights to break the darkness in the hallway and kitchen. But neither the light nor the brightness of the bulbs could chase away the feeling that I was being observed. One night, I woke up to a strange sound. It seemed like someone was taking steps on the other side of the wall, though the noise was faint and muffled. I got up and listened, but in the utter silence, I couldn't pinpoint where the sound was coming from. I checked the apartment, walked through each room, but found nothing unusual, yet the strange feeling lingered. After that night, I started to hear faint sounds in the dark, footsteps, a soft rustling, or a creak. They always came from different corners of the apartment, and I couldn't locate their source. It troubled me so much that I started sleeping with headphones on just to drown out the noises. At one point, I decided I needed a distraction. I started staying out later, lingering at work or stopping by a bar just to avoid coming back to that suffocating silence. But the more I avoided home, the stronger the silence seemed whenever I did return. The breaking point came one night when I heard a sound directly behind my door. It was late. I'd just come home and was getting ready for bed. Suddenly, there was a distinct creak in the corridor, as if someone was stepping carefully on the floor. I froze, my heart racing. Paralyzed, I stood by the door listening. Seconds dragged on, and I didn't know what to do. After a few minutes, I decided to look through the peephole. Slowly, I approached the door, held my breath, and peered out. The hallway, as always, was empty. The dim light illuminated the stairwell, and there was no sign of anyone there. But I was certain I'd heard that sound. From that moment, I noticed changes in myself. I became nervous, constantly looking over my shoulder on the street, listening intently to every rustle. My sleep grew more restless, and I increasingly caught myself dreading going back home. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. One morning, as I stepped outside, I headed straight to the nearest police station. I couldn't precisely explain what was happening, but I felt something was wrong in my apartment, on my floor. They listened to me with polite skepticism, telling me they received many such complaints and couldn't do anything without proof of an intrusion or threat. A few more weeks passed, and I was sure I had to move. One evening, after coming home and hearing that eerie sound again, I decided I couldn't endure it any longer. I took a few days off work and packed up everything over the weekend. By Monday, I was signing a new lease on the other side of town. Months went by. I lived in a new place, surrounded by neighbors, and every day I heard their noise and bustle. The strange feeling that had plagued me in my old apartment gradually faded, and I began to feel normal again. But one day, coming home from work, I bumped into an old neighbor from that building. We greeted each other, and I casually asked who lived on my former floor. He paused for a moment, then smiled. "Oh, no one's lived there since the building was built. That floor was designated as storage for the management company." His words froze me. No one lived on my floor. So all that time, all those sounds and footsteps. Recently, I experienced something horrifying. A man who had been in a psychiatric hospital was stalking me. I haven't dared to tell anyone about it. To this day, I can't be alone at home without feeling a creeping sense of dread. You know how, when you're sitting alone in an empty apartment, every little sound seems amplified. But what I went through was far worse than any trick of the imagination. I had just moved into a new apartment, cozy ground floor with a view of a small courtyard. The building was old with thick walls, so neighbors weren't likely to disturb me with noise. I was looking forward to peace and quiet after the hustle of the past few years. I felt comfortable in my new place, and I liked the area. The first thing that started bothering me was a faint feeling that someone was watching me. Sometimes, while sitting on the couch reading, I'd suddenly feel someone's eyes on me. I'd look around, but of course, there was no one there. It was a subtle sensation, not overpowering, but it made me uneasy. I decided to chalk it up to the stress of moving. Then I began to notice things weren't where I'd left them. At first, it was small stuff like my keys, which I usually left on the entry table, but would later find on the table in the living room. I thought maybe I'd forgotten moving them, but each day small changes piled up. One time, my toothbrush in the kitchen sink, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it in the bathroom. On the third day, I realized that the door to my apartment, which I always locked with 2 bolts, was sometimes just latched. I tried to be more vigilant, making sure to check that I'd locked it before going to bed. But in the morning, I'd find one of the bolts undone. I assumed it was just me being absent-minded. That evening, I came home late. It was around midnight. After placing my groceries on the kitchen counter, I felt a strange presence in the apartment. The air seemed different, almost thick. Even in the silence, I thought I heard faint breathing or a rustle in the hallway. Trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, I went into the bathroom, and that's when I noticed another small detail. A jar of cream wasn't in its usual spot, as though someone had moved it. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to explain it logically, maybe I'd shifted it and forgotten. But something inside me screamed that this wasn't the case. That night, I barely slept. I lay there listening to every sound in the apartment, but nothing seemed out of place. The next morning, I decided to test something. Before leaving, I arranged a few small items on the entry shelf in a specific order. When I came back home, I went straight to the shelf and saw that the objects had been rearranged as if someone had touched them. I decided to set up a hidden camera in the kitchen, directly across from the front door. I thought that maybe it was all in my head and I'd record the video to reassure myself that nothing strange was happening. The next day after work, I immediately checked the footage, and that's when my heart stopped. On the video, I could see the door to my apartment slowly open. There was no one visible in the frame, but I could hear soft footsteps. After a few seconds, the door closed again and silence settled over the kitchen. That was it. I watched the recording several times, not believing my own eyes. Someone had clearly been in my apartment. Even though they didn't show up on camera, it was undeniable. This wasn't my imagination. Each time I rewatched the footage, my anxiety grew. Still, I didn't want to tell anyone. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. The following night, I decided to stay alert. I sat on the couch in the dark, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. When the clock struck midnight, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible creak of the door. I froze, listening. The footsteps were quiet, barely audible, but I could hear them. They moved closer to the living room, and finally I saw a silhouette of a person standing in the doorway. He didn't move, just stood there staring in my direction. When I saw his eyes, I froze. They held a dark rage. I sat there in the darkness, paralyzed by fear, not daring even to blink. My heart was beating so loudly I thought he'd hear it and realize I was awake. He stood there for a few more minutes before turning around and leaving. When I heard the front door close, I could finally breathe again. I sat there in the pitch-black room, trying to process what had just happened. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The next morning, I went straight to the police, showed them the recording, and described the night visits from the stranger. They promised to investigate and advised me not to return there, at least for a while. In the days that followed, I stayed with a friend. A few weeks later, the police contacted me. They told me they'd found the man who'd been sneaking into my apartment. It turned out he was the previous tenant. He'd rented the place 2 years ago. Something had happened and he'd been taken to a psychiatric hospital. After a year of treatment, he was released. For some reason, he'd kept a key to the apartment and would come back at night thinking it was still his. He would silently enter, wander around the rooms, sit on the couch, look over his old belongings, and then leave. It's hard to explain how I felt in that moment. On one hand, it was horrifying to realize that a stranger had been so close, almost right next to me, watching, observing my every move. On the other hand, I felt a strange relief. It wasn't supernatural or mystical, just a case of a stranger invading my personal space. I returned to my apartment a few months later after changing all the locks and installing an alarm system. Living there wasn't easy. Every creak, every rustle made me jump. But eventually, the anxiety faded and I settled back into my normal life. Yet sometimes, sitting alone in the silence, I still feel as if someone is watching me. This is a story I don't really like to remember, but it left such a deep mark on me that even years later I can't forget a single moment. Some may consider it just a coincidence or a trick of the imagination, but I'm convinced that everything actually happened. Several years ago, I was working in another city. It was a big company, good pay, prospects, basically everything people tolerate monotonous, boring routines for. My life was settled and predictable, with each day going according to schedule, and I liked it. Every evening after work, I'd go home, eat, watch TV, and go to bed. I didn't seek out adventures or anything new. It all started rather inconspicuously. One evening, I noticed someone standing by the entrance to my apartment building. It was a man in a gray coat and a cap, his figure blurred under the streetlight. He had his back to me and seemed to be waiting for someone. I thought it was odd, but decided to ignore it. Maybe he was just lost or waiting for a taxi. But the next evening, he was there again. This time, he stood a bit closer to the entrance, and I could see his face better. He was an older man with short cropped hair and a serious expression. He didn't do anything suspicious, but the fact that he was there 2 nights in a row made me a bit uneasy. On the 3rd day, I saw him again, and this time our eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't greet me, just looked at me as if assessing me, then turned away. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few days passed, and I got used to his presence. Every evening he was there, sometimes standing a little further away, sometimes closer to the entrance. I began to have this strange feeling that he was watching me, though I had no evidence of it. One Friday evening, I stayed at work later than usual. As I left the building, I immediately thought of that man. A strange nervousness overcame me, and I decided to take a different route home to see if he would still be waiting in his usual spot. But this time, he wasn't there. I felt a little silly for having been so wary of him. The next day, I had to go out again. I was glad for the distraction, but as soon as I stepped outside, I saw him by the neighboring building. He was standing on the sidewalk, staring right at me. There was no doubt he was following me. I couldn't take it anymore, so I approached him and asked why he was always there and what he wanted from me. For a moment, he looked surprised at my question. He muttered something unintelligible and walked away, leaving me feeling a slight satisfaction for finally confronting him. But from then on, things only got worse. I began to see him everywhere. I'd leave the office and he'd be across the street. I'd go into a store and he'd walk by the window. I started thinking I was losing my mind or that this was some kind of cruel joke, but his face remained emotionless, calm, as if he was just observing. My colleagues began to notice. They asked why I was so nervous and anxious. I tried to explain, but when I told them everything, they just laughed and said I was probably overworked. No one took me seriously, and that only added to my anxiety. I started sleeping less, waking up each night in a cold sweat, checking to see if he was standing by my window. One night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I thought I heard the door creak. I froze, listening in the darkness. The apartment was quiet, but the thought crossed my mind. What if he managed to get inside? I got up, checked the locks, and went through the whole apartment. But of course, there was no one. I began avoiding going outside, especially at night. But one evening, as I was heading home, I saw him again. This time, he stood right across from my building entrance, as if he was waiting for me. My heart raced. Unable to bear it anymore, I approached him and told him to leave me alone. He looked at me silently, then said, "I just wanted to help." Those words pierced me. Help. Me. What did that mean? I tried to understand, but his face was like stone. He turned and walked away, leaving me in complete confusion. After that, he stopped appearing by my building, but the anxiety never left. I started to suspect that he was still watching, just keeping his distance. I no longer felt safe in my own home, at work, or on the street. Over the next few weeks, I tried to return to a normal life, convincing myself that it was all just my imagination. However, one morning I found a small note on my desk. It was short and written in a hand I didn't recognize. The note simply read, "Be careful." I started seeing him everywhere again, but now he always kept his distance. I realized that he didn't want me to notice his presence directly, but that only made things worse. I felt like I was losing control over my life. I couldn't sleep or eat. The thought that someone was constantly watching me wouldn't leave me for a second. At work, they gave me some time off, thinking I was overworked. That very day, I packed up and moved to another city, hoping to escape this nightmare. After some time, I managed to calm down a little. In my new place, no one was following me, and I began to hope that the nightmare had ended. I didn't tell anyone about it, not friends, not family. I just wanted to forget, to leave it all behind. But one day, as I was coming back from work, I saw him on the street again. As soon as we made eye contact, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing there, feeling my life collapse all over again. When I was offered the job, I was over the moon. It was good money and, more importantly, a decent position with prospects. The only downside was that the office was in another city, so moving was inevitable. I didn't hesitate. A new life, new acquaintances, it all seemed incredible to me at the time. I found an apartment through friends. It was small on the outskirts of the city, but cozy and quiet. There wasn't much space, just one room, a kitchen, and a small bathroom. I'm not the kind who dreams of luxurious apartments. I just wanted it to be clean and quiet, and the silence here was absolute. I even thought it was a plus. The first few days in the new city went surprisingly smoothly. I quickly got into the swing of things at work and started to adjust to my new responsibilities. Everything was going like clockwork, but one evening I felt a strange sense of unease. It happened without any obvious reason. I was just sitting in the living room reading the news on my phone. It seemed like an ordinary evening, but suddenly I felt as if someone was watching me. I put down my phone and looked around. Of course, no one was there. The feeling didn't last long, and I calmed down, deciding it was just the usual jitters of being in a new place. A week passed, and things at work were going better than ever. But at home, strange things began to happen. Sometimes it seemed like something had changed in my apartment. Nothing major, just small details that most people wouldn't even notice. Sometimes the things on my table looked a bit off, or the chair I left by the window was slightly moved. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just getting more anxious because of the new job. One night I was awakened by a strange sound, a faint creak, as if someone was cautiously stepping on the wooden floor. The floors in the apartment were indeed old, so at first I chalked it up to the building's age. But the sound repeated, and I realized it wasn't just the old boards someone was moving through my apartment. I froze, listening. Minutes passed and everything fell silent again. The next morning I shrugged off my fear, convincing myself it was just nerves. But after that it became a nightly occurrence. Every night at roughly the same time, I heard those same footsteps. They weren't loud, more like a whisper, but just enough to keep me awake. I began to doubt myself. Gradually I stopped sleeping at night, listening to those steps instead. Naturally, this affected my work. Colleagues noticed I was becoming increasingly irritable and exhausted, but I told no one about my nighttime fears. It sounded too strange. One night, I couldn't take it anymore and set up a camera in the hallway to record overnight. I just wanted to dispel my fears and prove to myself that no one was in the apartment. The next morning, I rushed to check the recording. At first glance, everything looked normal, but then I reached the part where I usually heard the footsteps, and my hair stood on end. The camera had caught faint shifts in light as if someone had passed by, but there was no silhouette or shadow. It seemed impossible. I tried to convince myself it was just a camera glitch, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that I couldn't explain what I had seen. For the next few days, I was careful to check everything in the apartment, even locking all the doors before going to bed. Another night came, and as usual, I lay in the dark, trying to force myself to sleep. Suddenly, I thought I heard not only footsteps, but also light breathing. I froze, my heart racing. The steps were getting closer, and it felt like someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, breathing so softly that I could barely hear it. I thought I was going insane. The next day, I decided to look for a new place, but apartments in this city were expensive, and I couldn't afford to move right away. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the result of stress and sleeplessness. But a week later, something happened that made me truly question my sanity. In the evening, when I got home from work, I noticed one of the cups in the kitchen was broken. I lived alone, and the cup couldn't have fallen on its own. I looked around the apartment again and noticed faint, muddy footprints on the floor by the door. They led from the hallway to my bedroom. I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine. Panic set in, and I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? That I heard footsteps and found a few dirty marks in my apartment. They would think I was crazy. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bed, staring into the darkness, bracing myself for whoever or whatever might appear. The footsteps started again closer to dawn. They were quiet but distinct, and I knew they were coming toward the bedroom. It felt like someone was cautiously but deliberately walking toward me. Suddenly, I felt a faint movement of air as if the door had slightly opened. I didn't know what to do. Fear paralyzed me. The footsteps stopped. I sat there listening to the silence, unable to move. Minutes passed, and I thought it was over. But then I heard someone slowly exhale about a foot away from me. It was too real. I jumped out of bed and turned on the light, but as before, no one was there. The next morning, I made a decision. I had to leave this place. I took a leave from work and found temporary housing with a friend. I spent the next few days away from that apartment, but the feeling of dread lingered. I couldn't shake the thought that whoever or whatever was there was still watching me. A week later, my realtor called saying they'd found a tenant for my apartment. I signed all the paperwork with relief, knowing I would never return there. It's been a few years since then, but I still remember every detail. Now, whenever I think I hear footsteps in my new apartment, I try to ignore them. But sometimes, when the world outside is completely silent, I feel a chill run over my skin, and I hear that same slow, deep breathing. When I rent an apartment, I try to stay out of other people's business. Neighbors have always been like shadows to me. Someone flickers by in the hallway, we exchange a nod, and that's it. But this time, I learned just how dangerous it can be to simply observe someone else's life. I moved into this apartment about 6 months ago. The neighborhood was quiet, and the apartment was in a prime location, top floor, windows overlooking an empty lot, no busy roads or noisy clubs nearby. The only thing that unsettled me was the building across the street. It was a typical Soviet-style apartment block, but half of the windows were dark. It seemed like almost no one lived there, and those who did behaved strangely. There was complete silence on the landings, and I rarely saw kids or groups hanging out in the yard. Not that I cared much. One of the few alive windows in the building across the street faced directly opposite my kitchen. In the evenings, I occasionally noticed a light in that window. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I started noticing a man sitting there looking outside. It became a nightly occurrence. He didn't look strange or scary, just an ordinary man, probably around 45 or so. He had sharp features and short-cropped hair. Sometimes he smoked. Other times, he just stared into the void. One evening, when I stepped out onto my balcony, I decided to wave at him. I don't know why, I just felt like it. The man looked directly at me but didn't respond. He didn't wave back, didn't avert his gaze, he just kept looking. It was a bit awkward, but I forgot about it soon enough. A couple of weeks later, I noticed him more frequently. He wasn't just at the window anymore, he'd started sitting out on his balcony too. One evening, I realized that his gaze was deliberately tracking me when I went out onto my balcony. If I stayed out for a bit, he'd stare at me intently. To be honest, it started to irritate me. I began noticing little things. When I'd turn off the kitchen lights in the evening and step out for a smoke, I'd feel like he was sitting there in the dark, watching. Sometimes I'd turn the lights back on and deliberately look his way. He'd either pretend to be busy with something else or just disappear from view. Then it escalated. One night, I heard the faint buzz of a messenger notification. It wasn't my phone, it sounded like vibrations through the walls. A minute later, I received a message from an unknown number. "Why are you up so late?" That caught me off guard, but I figured someone must have sent it by mistake and ignored it. A few days later, it happened again. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea when another message arrived. "What are you drinking tea with?" I froze, staring at my phone. It was nighttime. The apartment was dark, and I was sitting right by the window. I stepped out onto the balcony and looked sharply toward his apartment. As always, the man was there, but this time he didn't look away. His face seemed almost like he was smiling. I replied, "Who is this?" No answer. It started weighing on me heavily. At work, I'd catch myself thinking about him, how he stared, how he messaged me. In the evenings, I tried not to go near the window, but curiosity always got the better of me. Sometimes I felt like I could sense his gaze even through the closed curtains. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to trace where the messages were coming from. The messaging app allowed me to determine the approximate location of the sender. I opened the settings and yes, it was the building across the street. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe he somehow saw my number, accidentally, spied on me. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the couch thinking about what to do. Ideas ranged from simply moving to another apartment to confronting him directly. The next morning, things got worse. When I woke up and checked my phone, there was a new message. "Why are you thinking about me?" I replied. "Who are you? What do you want?" After a few minutes, a response came. "We're neighbors. I'm just making sure everything is fine." I laughed nervously. Fine. What kind of absurdity was this? I tried looking him up on social media, scouring for any information, but found nothing. That evening, I decided to go to his building, just to check. When I got there, I noticed that the entrance was dilapidated. The glass on the door was shattered, and the staircase inside was littered with dust and debris. But I went up to his floor and found his door. There was no number on it, but I could smell cigarette smoke wafting from underneath. He was definitely there. I knocked. No one answered. A minute later, my phone buzzed again. "Don't come inside. Just go back home." That night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I locked all the doors and windows and sat in the kitchen. I needed to figure out who this man was and why he was doing this. Around 10 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, the message read, "Neighbor, you know I can see you, right?" Panic set in. I turned off the lights and peeked through the curtains. He was standing by his window, staring at me as if reveling in my fear. I rushed outside and called the police. When they arrived and entered his apartment, they found nothing. The room was empty. The only thing left was a pile of cigarette butts on the balcony. Now I live in a different apartment, but sometimes I still feel like someone is watching me from the shadows. When I tell this story, people often think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. This happened to me, and even years later, I remember every detail as if it were yesterday. I worked at a small digital marketing company. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid enough to cover my rent and order takeout. The only downside was staying late at the office. Sometimes I was the last to leave. One Thursday, my coworkers left earlier than usual. We had a deadline, and I needed to finish a report. By the time I was done, it was past midnight. I closed my laptop, stretched, and stepped into the dark office corridor. The building was completely silent. Not a sound. It was a typical office center, but at night it felt almost abandoned. The ceiling lights flickered on with a delay as I walked toward the exit. That flickering always annoyed me. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button to call it. The air inside the building felt heavy, as if the walls were soaked in stale air. The elevator arrived and its doors opened with a dull creak. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the first floor, and the cab began its descent. Halfway down, the elevator suddenly stopped. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. But when the light in the cab went out, I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. I stood in total darkness, feeling only the faint vibration of the cab. Panic set in. I started pressing buttons, but nothing happened. My phone was in my pocket, and I quickly pulled it out. The screen lit up the cab, but there was no signal. I tried calling the building's support line, but the call wouldn't go through. 5 minutes passed. I stood there trying to stay calm. Then I thought I heard a faint noise, a soft rustling, like someone running their hand along the metal wall of the elevator. I quickly turned, shining my phone's light at the wall. Nothing. It's just nerves, I told myself. But the sound came again. This time, it was closer. I remembered the elevators in this building were old and told myself it was probably just the cables. But my heart was racing. Suddenly, the elevator jolted and the light came back on. The cab resumed its descent as if nothing had happened. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the empty first-floor lobby. Outside, I took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to shake off the incident. At home, I tried to distract myself, put on a show, ate something from the fridge, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. I kept feeling like I'd forgotten something. When I went to bed, I was haunted by a strange dream. I saw the same elevator, but its walls were smeared with something dark. In the corner of the cab stood a figure resembling a person, but their face was hidden in shadow. I woke up in a cold sweat. The clock read 4:18. Now I picked up my phone to check messages and noticed something strange. A new recording had appeared in the voice recorder app. I hadn't made it. At first, I thought I must have accidentally hit record when I used the flashlight in the elevator, but the file was over 3 minutes long. I hit play. The first thing I heard was the usual ambient noise, probably the sound of the elevator machinery. But then faint footsteps began. They sounded as if someone was pacing inside the cab while I was there. This can't be real, I thought. On the recording, I could clearly hear myself breathing heavily as I tried to figure out what was going on. But the most terrifying part came at the end. A barely audible whisper said my name. Alex. The recording stopped. I couldn't believe my ears. I played it again and again, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just noise from the elevator or a glitch in the recording. But why did it say my name? The next day, I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. It sounded too ridiculous. Work went on as usual, but by evening, I was alone in the office again. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. As I was getting ready to leave, a coworker from a neighboring department approached me and asked, "Were you in the office last night?" I said yes and asked why she was asking. She hesitated before replying. "It's just, I thought I heard someone walking in the corridor when I was leaving. I thought it might have been you. That unsettled me. I'd been alone in the office that night." A couple of days later, I decided to analyze the recording. I didn't know much about audiophiles, but I found a program online that let me isolate frequencies and sounds. When I loaded the file, everything seemed normal until I zoomed in on the whisper. It wasn't just random noise, the frequency perfectly matched a human voice. I felt my fear turn into paranoia. A week passed. I tried to forget about it, but the anxiety lingered. Every time I stepped into an elevator, my breathing quickened and my hands turned cold. One night, I stayed late again. This time I took the stairs. Outside, I glanced back at the building. A light was on in the office, even though I was certain I'd turned it off. A chill ran down my spine. I hurried home. That night, I had another dream. I stood in a dark corridor, hearing a faint whisper behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there, but the feeling of someone being close was so real I could feel warm breath on my neck. When I woke up, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told my boss I wanted to work from home. Years have passed since then. I changed apartments and jobs, but sometimes in complete silence I still hear footsteps or a whisper saying my name. I've always considered myself a person with strong nerves. Working in delivery, I've grown used to night shifts, sketchy neighborhoods, and unfriendly customers. If someone had told me this story, I would have probably laughed and brushed it off as a figment of their imagination. But now I realize the line between reality and fear can be shockingly thin. This happened about 6 months ago. I had picked up an extra shift to earn some extra cash. The night seemed calm, just a quiet Friday in the city. No holidays, no major events. Orders were sparse, and it felt like I was just aimlessly driving through empty streets. Around 11 p.m., I got an order from a small pizzeria. The address, an old residential area on the outskirts of town. I was familiar with the neighborhood. It was full of old wooden houses, half of which were abandoned. The streets were poorly lit, and the pavement looked like it had been through a war. I'd delivered to that area before, and it usually involved odd encounters. Sometimes the customers weren't home. Other times they came out in strange robes, as if expecting someone else. But those were minor things I'd gotten used to. I arrived at the address. The house looked dilapidated with a crooked fence and dark windows. Another order for some recluse, I thought. My phone vibrated, showing the client's number. I called, glancing around as I waited. No answer. I tried again, but still no response. Sighing, I got out of the car and approached the gate. I rang the doorbell. Nothing. Maybe it's another address mix-up, I thought, but decided to check anyway. Leaving without attempting delivery wasn't in the rules, and I didn't want to miss out on the tip. As I got closer, I noticed the gate was slightly ajar. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling like movement from inside the house. I knocked on the door. "Pizza delivery," I called out loudly. There was no response. I tried the door, but it was locked. Then, barely audible, as if muffled by the walls, I heard a voice. A woman's voice speaking in a strange, almost sing-song tone. My nerves tightened, but I decided to wait a few more minutes. Then I heard something else, quick footsteps, as if someone descended the stairs and stopped near the door. My heart pounded. I was about to knock again when the door abruptly swung open. Standing there was a middle-aged woman in a gray robe. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes looked tired or frightened. "Pizza, right?" she asked, slightly out of breath. "Yes." "You didn't answer, so I thought maybe I had the wrong address." She glanced over her shoulder as if checking for something behind her, then quickly took the box. "Thanks. Here's the money." She shoved some bills into my hand and slammed the door shut. I stood there for a moment trying to process the odd encounter. Customers were usually either friendly or irritated, but this woman seemed like she'd been caught off guard. When I got back to my car, I noticed she'd overpaid a lot. The money she'd given me was about 3 times the cost of the order. I tried calling her again, but once more, there was no answer. On my next delivery, I tried to brush off the encounter, but something about it stuck with me. Later that night, after my shift ended, I decided to drive past the house again just to make sure everything was okay. The house looked the same. Dark windows, no signs of life. The gate was closed. A sense of unease crept over me. The next day, I mentioned the incident to my coworkers. They just laughed it off. One of them joked that weird things always happened in that area. But later, I learned something that made me see that night in a whole new light. Over the weekend, I ran into an acquaintance who used to live in that neighborhood. When I mentioned the address, his expression changed. "You delivered there?" he asked. "Yeah." "Why?" He hesitated. "That house. No one's lived there for years. There was a fire a couple of years ago. The husband died, and his wife disappeared. They searched for her but never found her." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "Not funny. I was there 2 days ago. Delivered a pizza to a woman." He gave me a look like I just said something insane. "You must have gotten the address wrong. Nobody lives there." But I hadn't gotten it wrong. The next day, driven by curiosity, I went back to the house. This time, I parked farther away and walked up. The gate was shut, and it looked like no one had been there in ages. The yard was overgrown, and a rusty padlock hung on the front door. I stood there, trying to make sense of it. Then, a man from a neighboring house, a grumpy-looking old man, noticed me. "What do you want here?" he called out. I walked over and explained about the delivery. The man frowned. "Don't know what you're talking about. That place has been empty for years." I left feeling uneasy. Had I made a mistake? Or had the woman really been living there illegally? This story might have remained a strange mystery in my mind if not for one final twist. A few days later, I stumbled upon a news article. In that same area, police had discovered a woman hiding in one of the abandoned houses. She had apparently been on the run for years. Among her belongings, they found a pizza box, the same box with my company's logo. Since then, I've stopped working night shifts.